Hi, my name is Nick. I have an idea for a story. I want to be a writer, and this is where I'll be writing. So it's the 8th of February, and I've been working quite hard last few days since the last video. I've actually been thinking a lot about the recent novel coronavirus happening in mainland China, the Hong Kong protests, and a bit of an inspiration on my book, actually, in terms of what's happening over there. I know I've been talking about China recently, and simply by chance it seems to have been related to what's happening currently at this time of history in terms of the protests and the coronavirus. So I'm going to talk about that. I just want to talk about sort of like a bit about the space. So what I've got going on here is a new book I've been reading, a couple of other bits and pieces I found. Nothing really has changed much in terms of what I wanted to write. I haven't changed any of my plans, but I've just been making some other arrangements up here on the bulletin board. I've drawn this diagram, which I'll talk about probably not in this video, but in another one. This is just a quick one about some 6 sort of gods or entities I'm going to talk about. Some other bits and pieces of interest, the Lucky 13 Club and some Russian influences and some other bits and pieces. But I've really been interested in what's been happening, so I've kind of been preoccupied a little bit at work, a little bit with keeping up to date with current affairs and friends that I have in China and making sure that they're okay and they know what's happening and that they can contact me. And the news is the same both inside and outside of China because there's some discrepancy in statistics. And in terms of the book, you know, I actually have been writing quite a bit and nothing's sort of finalized, so I haven't made a podcast or a video just of me talking yet, mainly because I have nothing finalized, but I have a few notes that I can definitely finalize to become 3 or 4 or 5 sort of chapters that I will read at some point. I do also have here a huge collection of like notes and improvements on those notes and sort of first edits. Some of them have got like these notes to them. Some of them have just got like lots of writing on top of them. But I've been working. I haven't been procrastinating. But I thought what would be interesting today would be to talk about another tier in the worship pyramid. So last time I talked about these people that were called the Guildborg, and they produce goods and services far away, and they use the orb abyss to teleport those goods and services and designs to the people on Earth. And now I'm going to talk about someone else, another character type that's the 8th tier. And I haven't decided whether they're the 9th tier or the 8th tier, but they're very down below the bottom. And what I'll do for the next 9 videos is I will explain the context and the universe that my book is happening by describing each successive tier of the worship pyramid. Alright, so 8th of February, and a lot of talk about the coronavirus and the protests in Hong Kong, and you know, I thought it fitting to discuss the next tier in the worship pyramid. I've talked about who these people that are called the Guildborg, and now I'm going to talk about maybe the next tier up from that. I haven't decided if it's the 9th and the 8th or the 8th and the 9th, but almost at the bottom together with the Guildborg are a character type called the Merge, and they have merged with technology. They are completely not of the reality that they are actually in. They're experiencing a simulation, and I want to talk about simulation theory and gamers and virtual reality and a whole lot of other bigger concepts that relate to literature and how these characters that I'm talking about will play a very important part in my book. I want to also talk about this amazing book, which I'm about halfway through now, and Alex Haley's Roots is just so interesting and eye-opening, and I think it's really well written. Apparently, I just listened to a interview with the author, I think just before he died in 1991, I think he died. Alex Haley said Roots has had this big, massive impact on American culture. It was released in the 70s, I think 1976, on the bicentennial. He says in the foreword that it's almost a present to his country to make them aware of their history and parts of its history that are not talked about enough and that are quite embarrassing and make people quite awkward and some Americans deeply uncomfortable. It came out at an interesting time, and he said he was really glad it came out in the 70s rather than the 60s, because I think it was almost ready to publish in 1964 after he did, or maybe 1966, sorry, after he did the autobiography of Malcolm X. And he said if it had come out then, I think it would have put fuel on the fire, but as it came out in 1976, at the same time people were looking at the history of America and the interesting, complicated, and at times difficult to define characteristics that made America what it is today. I know that those terms of freedom and freedom for others, freedom of expression, freedom of choice, isolationism, free markets, capitalism, upward mobility, a democracy, they're difficult subjects and topics, and they all came to a head in 1976 when people were celebrating America, and he was fortunate enough that that's when Roots came out. In the same decade, they made the first movie based off of Roots, also called Roots, and it was remade for History Channel not too long ago. I happened to be recommended this book, and I'm really glad I'm reading it for more than one reason. It's a fascinating read. It's not like I wasn't aware of the Atlantic slave trade or anything like that. It's more that I have enjoyed reading the parts of the book that are set in Africa and the very different ways that the native Africans had names for different people in society and how complicated their society was. So at the beginning of the book, Kunta Kinte is describing Africa, manhood rights and all these other interesting ritualistic phenomena are occurring at the beginning of the book. And there's all these different types of people that have got different names. They're Muslim, they're living in one tiny African village, they're Mandinka people, and even before he gets captured and put on a slave ship to go to the cotton fields of Southern America, it's fascinating at every point. There's certainly not many books like it. By complete chance, it's got a lot to do with what I want to write about, and perhaps I was drawn to it. There have been some other books that I've talked about that I've begun to read, and I just haven't been able to get into them for whatever reason, because I haven't been able to relate, or I didn't like the writing style. And this book I haven't been able to put down. I'm also reading We by Zamyatin, but I'm finding it sort of like a not quite as well written 1984 from a Russian perspective. And it's interesting, short chapters with weird names. There's a lot lost in translation, I find, with Russian texts. I like some Russian writers. I'm not like some literature fans that just spin off a whole lot of Russian writers and think that they're incredibly intellectual because they've read these so-called masters of the genres. But I'm not finding it as readable as Alex Haley. I thought it was time to talk about the next tier in the worship pyramid. But first of all, I want to talk about the two things that relate to this particular character type in the worship pyramid, the merge that I'm going to talk about. But first of all, I want to talk about the coronavirus in mainland China, and more specifically how the Chinese government has been trying to dampen any reports that are not complimentary to its country. As of the 8th of February. According to my sources on the internet that are not Chinese sites, there is at present 31,481 cases of the novel coronavirus and 638 deaths, including a Dr. Li Wenliang, who actually was one of the first people to identify it as a pandemic and who warned of the outbreak of it, but was told by the Chinese government to basically dampen those fears and not to tell too many people about it, and also told to tell people who came under his care to not talk to other people beyond the walls of the hospital, to quieten things down. Chinese premier seems to only be really worried about Hong Kong's increasing recession, really, which is odd and also insightful to how things work in that country. And also how the Chinese government has tried to control how people perceive it and its impact on the global financial market, the stock market, and Hong Kong going into recession. And the other thing that's a nice segue is also the Hong Kong protests. They've actually began prior to the coronavirus and are continuing. And both relate really well to what I'm going to talk about in terms of this character type. So, the coronavirus, or the novel coronavirus, I should say, it's basically the new SARS. And SARS was something that happened in the early 2000s, severe acute respiratory syndrome, and it's nothing new, but it's a highly contagious virus that is affecting thousands in mainland China. So what first attracted me to the Hong Kong protests, though, was actually the missing booksellers from 2018 onwards, and I read about the fact that a lot of booksellers that had any literature that was anti-Chinese government, these people were just disappearing overnight. Their book shops were disappearing as well. That has actually paled in comparison and been pushed out of importance by the Hong Kong protests, but they are related, I'm sure. So, quick history lesson. Essentially, Hong Kong has been part of the British Empire, really, and was only returned to China in 1997, but under these terms called one country, two systems. And the one country, two systems agreed upon terms that England gave Hong Kong back to China was that there would be slightly different rules within Hong Kong. And one of those was the rights of the citizens of Hong Kong, that they had the right to assemble, the right to freedom of speech, and the right to vote, amongst other things, which is not technically what citizens of China, like Chinese nationalists, have. Another really important thing that they also have, which I forgot to say, is access to free press. And that's a really important one, which relates to the coronavirus, because if you have a press, as in reporters or media, that can accurately, realistically report on events, then you have something closer to a true free system. These rights that I'm talking about aren't really allowed in China, but it's fuzzy logic. It's not exactly clear what they do and do not have. So there's this concept called the mandate of heaven, and I guess the closest European equivalent would probably be the divine right of kings, really. And the divine right of kings is something that it's always mentioned when you study something like the French Revolution, in terms of kings being given the right by God to be kings and to be the top of their hierarchy. And this is so relevant in terms of my book, and it's also applicable to what's happening in China, because the mandate of heaven really speaks about looking for signs that there should be a change in government. So it kind of goes like this. It's and this has been applied to Mao in the communist regime, and in the People's Revolution, the Communist Party of the 1950s, and its current state, and even before then with emperors. Essentially, a new dynasty or a government or an emperor or a party or whatever you want to say brings peace when they replace an old dynasty or kingdom or king or whatever, or party. And then the next stage is that the established class overtaxes their people, doesn't treat them right, and then there's a phenomenon of either people protesting or a huge massive natural disaster, and this signals the need for change for a new dynasty. And the weird thing is that this relates, to the protests and the coronavirus. So exactly a year ago, there was a Chinese couple, Chan Tong Kai and Poon Hyo Wing. They went on holiday in Taipei, in Taiwan, and he killed his wife. He returned to China, admitted the crime, and then there was a problem. There's no extradition agreement between Hong Kong and Taiwan. At the time there wasn't. So because the crime of him murdering his wife, Chan Tong Kai couldn't be punished in China for that crime exactly, and there was no extradition agreement, which meant that he could not be brought from one country to another based on that crime. As it was, he was back in China when he admitted it, which makes it interesting. And there's a lot of places that Hong Kong doesn't have extradition agreements with, because it operates, up until this point, almost like a European country. Remembering that it has roots with the British Empire, and it was only in 1997, within my lifetime when I was a teenager, when this was given back to China, but under the one country, two systems agreement terms. So Hong Kong made this new law based off this case, allowing suspects of crimes occurring outside of Hong Kong to be brought to mainland China, and basically the protests were sparked by this change. Like the missing booksellers is a good example of the few rights that Chinese people have, that they can go missing overnight, and nothing much is really done about it. But this was all building up to the protests. So the bill is called the Fugitive Offenders Amendment Bill, and what it basically means is that it allows for the extradition of criminals to mainland China for crimes that occur outside of Hong Kong. So that has been perceived as a slippery slope to the people in Hong Kong starting to lose their rights as they understand them now. And the bill is basically to establish a mechanism for transfers of fugitives, not only from Taiwan now. The introduction of this bill caused massive widespread criticism domestically and abroad, from everyone that understood it, journalists, people of the press, legal professions, business groups, people that were working with other countries, because there's a lot of people, I don't know if you know this, but there's a lot of people that work in Hong Kong that have got connections with non-Chinese countries, and it's a way for them, and it's software, robotics, industry in China, and they do their business through Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a conduit for the rest of China for a lot of countries. And in 1997, China was not the superpower that it is today. It was not quite as powerful and influential, and could not make demands on the rest of the world based on trade agreements, for example, or AI and other things. So it was a very different world back then. So the Hong Kong protests, the photos are just insane. Unprecedented amounts of people joining in on them, and again, this is going to change possibly, but as of 8th of February 2020, there's been 2,000 injured, 7,000 arrested, 2 dead, as far as we know. And there's signs that literally read, extradition law equals no human rights, plus no rule of law. And people are shouting in the streets, Hong Kong independence, the only way out. So that basically sums up for you what the protests are fighting about and for. Going back to the other thing that could be the sign of the mandate of heaven in terms of things changing or needing to change in China is the novel coronavirus. And again, it's not just the virus itself from a microbiological sort of standpoint or a medical view. It's actually from a political view, in terms of the Premier of China being really worried about the recession caused by the protests in Hong Kong, and really worried about the impact on business and trading and production and all these other things, which, you know, they're relevant, I suppose, when you think about like what China does for the world, and it's worth noting, but it's almost a way of understanding the way of thinking of China, that would be their biggest concern. It's like, oh no, this virus is going to cause a downfall in our production. It all started in the Huainan seafood market in Wuhan, in China, and this is a wet market, and a wet market, you know, if you've never been to one, it's fairly gross, to be perfectly honest, as someone who's pretty much a vegan now. And even when I wasn't a vegan, I still knew that there was something deeply wrong and, I don't know, unsettling about the amount of live animals at these markets, and the importance of freshness, which I've never really understood. I mean, there's other things that happen in China, like the cruelty to animals that are about to be eaten, and the belief that the belief in adrenaline in the animal before its death has some impact on its taste. You know, so if we think of like something like the CCTV, which is basically the Chinese Communist state media, that really underplayed the effects of the virus when it became obvious that this virus was really emanating from Wuhan, and it was the beginning of a pandemic, and it was going to be widespread, and it was affecting thousands of people, and it wasn't quite SARS. You know, what CCTV did is that they put out a mass message for their people saying, we wish everyone a quiet, peaceful, joyous spring festival, because of course this happened around, unfortunately, around Chinese New Year's. So there was thousands, millions of people moving to and from China and around China, and that, of course, assisted with its spread. It's going to affect especially what's called the lost generation in China. And the lost generation are people that were affected, not necessarily born within, but affected by the Cultural Revolution. And a really great book about the impact of the lost generation on even today's culture is Wild Swans, which I talked about before. So the lost generation in that one would have been the mum of the author, who lived under Mao Zedong. And, you know, the people that lived through this, the lost generation of the Cultural Revolution in China, are basically undereducated. They're damaged emotionally, psychologically damaged. You know, like if you think about all the intellectuals that were identified in families and being removed from their families and punished, or taken from their cities and taken to work on farms because they were intellectuals. It's baffling. It's one of those cases where you can really say that fact is stranger than fiction. I cannot believe the things that I read in that book. I can't believe it really happened. And in you know, the 50s and the 60s as well. If you think about what was happening around the world, the civil rights movement, and, you know, the swinging 60s, and the sexual revolution as well as the civil rights movement, and China was going through this insanity. So in response to the ongoing and continually underplayed coronavirus that has really been managed quite badly, I believe, but I mean, it could be that it's just such a massive country. It could be that it was one of the worst times for it to be hit by it. China has basically decided to inject the world economy with $174 billion to boost confidence. $174 billion to boost confidence. It smells of older attempts in history to saving economies, and which really only leads to inflation. Incentives like printing paper money in Germany, that's what it reminds me of. We'll see if it has an impact. I mean, like, the interesting thing about it is that when China has decided to inject the world economy with so much, it smells of fear itself, which in effect can actually, weirdly enough, create fear that they're doing so much to counteract it, if you know what I mean. But it's complex. You know, understanding economics is like understanding psychology. It's very much related. And the reason why I wanted to talk about the coronavirus and the Hong Kong protests is not just because of the mandate of heaven and how that relates to this character type. It's also on a visual level, because I see people in Wuhan and other parts in China now wearing a mask, of course, and people in very populated areas, especially in places like Asia, have always traditionally, when there's a sickness around, or even just when they're feeling sick, or they know other people are sick, or it's just flu season, they wear a mask. And I thought it related to the character type that I'm going to talk about, the merge. And I thought it appropriate to wear something that might fit the outbreak of the coronavirus and this character type. And you know, the interesting thing is how dehumanizing wearing a mask and sunglasses and a hat really is, isn't it? It's kind of weird talking with it, and I hope you can hear me okay. I'm just gonna have to talk really loudly. Maybe if I just talk like this, it's probably better. I'm gonna have to take the mask off. It's not realistic. It's not merge-like, but you get the idea. So, the idea for the merge really basically came from this podcast, Joe Rogan podcast, and he had Elon Musk on, and he famously smoked marijuana. It was a brilliant podcast. I've listened to it 3 or 4 times, but you know, like because it's Elon Musk, he's talking about tunnels in California and traffic and sending cars to the moon and cars that can dance and a whole lot of crazy stuff because it's Elon Musk, right? And it's also Joe Rogan, and also they're both high, so you can't go wrong. At the beginning of the podcast, he actually encouraged people to change his Wikipedia page from a magnate to a magnet, which I thought was cool, and I participated in that. I also changed the definition of elephant a couple of times because Stephen Colbert asked me to. He discussed how close people were to basically being an android now because of our proximity to a smartphone, and you know, our constant connection to the internet for answers, you know, like constantly, like if we don't know something or if you want to prove your friend wrong, you just like get out your smartphone, you check it out. It takes a couple of seconds. And how, you know, in a couple of generations, it might be that there's bionic implants so that we don't have to get it out of our pocket. It's just in a pocket in our mind. He said, you know, we're basically already androids, if you think about it. So I've been reading Roots by Alex Haley, obviously, and it became a popular History Channel documentary miniseries in 2016, I think. And I think the film came out the year after it was published in 1977. Neither of which I've watched, but I'm really enjoying the book. I knew it existed, but I haven't actually watched them. I'm really enjoying the book though. I don't know how it ends. It's basically 6 generations of African Americans, starting with Kunta Kinte, who's actually an African, a Mandinka, and who actually gets captured and put on a slave boat. One thing I really liked about the introduction to the book is that all the characters in the African part of the book have these Muslim traditions. They're basically praying at regular intervals throughout the day, but they have some ancient pagan beliefs as well. And when he gets to Maryland, when he works on a plantation as a slave, you know, he tries to still make these little talismans that are almost voodoo-like, which I guess how voodoo, evolved. I don't know. He has these little belief systems that he still adheres to, as well as being Muslim. So religion is a massive, massive topic in that book. And, you know, like the fact that he starts off as Muslim and then, you know, 6 generations later, his forebears are Christian is pretty interesting as well. And there's all these types of people mentioned in the book, which is pretty cool. So that in the beginning part of the African section of the book, before his capture, there's these people called griots, which are wise men, holy men, kind of shaman, witch doctor types. And what they do is that they remember all the names of the famous people in the tribe, because it's oral history, obviously. And then there's the Arafang, who are teachers, Moro, which are teachers of teachers, Kintango, which are manhood trainers, Kafo, which I think I'm pronouncing some of these, I don't know. There's these age groups. They operate almost like kind of a caste system, but it's by age. But, you know, you're more important the older you get, obviously. And the interesting thing is that only your son can follow you in your job description. So only the son of an Arafang can become an Arafang. and only the son of a griot can become a griot. So you have the beginning of these kind of like set traditions of people following their parents into a particular trade. I suppose in European terms that's not that unusual, you know, like bakers becoming bakers and all that kind of stuff. But as I was reading the book, sorry, I'm just trying to use my hands because I'm wearing gloves, so I might be gesticulating a little bit more. I was actually planning on wearing the mask, but you can't hear me with the mask, so I'm just going to continue gesticulating. So I began researching the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade, and then I, you know, once I began starting to read Roots, especially the part where he gets captured and put on a slave ship and sold and becomes a slave. And it kind of reminds me of the thrall caste system in Viking culture, and how people were basically taken from their raids. And it reminded me also of what little I know of the European slaves that were captured by the Barbary Muslim pirates of the Ottoman Empire in about the 17th century. I know this mainly from studying art history, though, it has to be said, because a lot of the paintings made based on the Barbary pirates and the sex slaves, basically, that were taken from Europe, that basically the white slaves of the Barbary pirates is how it's meant to be referred to. But I think that there's possibly like an element of mythical extrapolation in terms of that particular history, because, you know, I mean, most of the paintings are always depicting these naked white women and these evil-looking Ottoman kings, and it's I don't know, I feel like it's been exaggerated a little bit under artistic license, to be perfectly honest. But we know it happened. But then there's the Egyptians, of course, and who used Nubians, who were Africans, and the Jewish people as well, for the construction of the pyramids and everything else, and mainly for building purposes. So it made me realize that, you know, like, slaves are used for different purposes based on that culture. So you have the massive cotton industry of the southern parts of the US, the sex slaves of the Barbary pirates in what was a very formally restrictive and controlling religious system of the Ottoman Empire and Muslim belief. And you have the Egyptians using their slaves for building purposes, and the Romans used their slaves for a huge variety of jobs, but who infamously and interestingly freed their slaves if they represented the empire in the army to, you know, go on a campaign. So it's interesting, all these different cultures, how they set up, you know, castes, but basically pyramidical. Again, they're pyramidical. Anyway, what I'm getting to is, my point is that slaves are used for a variety of jobs: construction, or farming, or the army, or sex with gross pirates. And they're basically jobs nobody wants, you know, job descriptions that are better suited to what is called slave labor. You know, we can't find anyone to do it, so we're going to make people do it that we basically conquer. This is the character type that I'm describing. These people that are just covered in masks and removed from reality, you know, the merge. So they're just covered in technology, and they're not part of the empire that I'm describing in the worship pyramid. So going back to the Orb Abyss, it's, you know, like, as I've described, the important concept in my book is this, basically the futuristic version of the internet, which is called the Orb Abyss, which is an emotional network idea. And I started thinking, well, how would a slave be used in this world? What would you get a slave to do? What would be right down at the bottom, or near to the bottom? And my idea is kind of like a prism, that people are sort of like crystals themselves, and they can continue this energy signal, kind of like fiber cable. And the prism also reminded me of pyramids and triangles and hierarchies and the three estates of the pre-revolutionary France. And also, you know, the Dark Side of the Moon cover by Pink Floyd, and how that album is essentially about life. You know, it's about life and death and money and insanity. So I was working on the posit that all human beings are psychic beings, and they're crystals in this big, massive nexus, this hugely complicated network of networks, which their whole civilization relies on this futuristic internet emotional network. And the slaves that I'm getting around to describing in this video is basically people that would be used, like modems or servers are used in the internet, and they basically form altars, and those altars might be of, you know, like triangles or hexagons or nonagons, and they basically stand around and they allow teleportation to occur. So if the orb abyss is this emotional network I'm describing, we need some of these slaves to feel joy, we need them to feel despair at specific amounts. So this like sparked my already sort of like established interest in simulation theory, or simulation hypothesis. And it basically proposes that all of reality, everything that we see, including the Earth, the universe, the solar system, everything, could be or is in fact an artificial simulation. And the modern concept of it nowadays is, oh, it's a computer simulation. But this reminds me, you know, I was just talking to someone the other day that, you know, we constantly change how we describe the universe. You know, like in Newtonian times when people were using basically Newtonian principles to describe everything, they used the billiard balls sort of concept to describe the universe and the Big Bang and all that kind of stuff. And we've moved past that to string theory and all that other stuff. And we're getting closer and closer. Modern astrophysicists are using terminology that using the same sort of lexicon as computer programmers would use to describe the internet. And French astronomers of the 17th century, if they didn't use Newtonian physics, they would use something almost akin to water pressure. Like they were describing fountains and hoses and propulsion and all these other kinds of things. So they're using water features. So they always use it under the most complex terminology that they have at their disposal. And at present, astrophysicists are getting closer and closer to using terms from the internet to describe the solar system and the birth of the universe. But let's be honest, it's not a fountain, it's not a billiard ball, it's not the internet, it's not a computer program, it's none of those things. And so simulation theory, using this concept of the computer simulation, it's like we're living inside a video game. It goes way, way, way back beyond people having computer games, though. It's just that it's described in those terms now. I mean, the proposed technology that would seem realistic enough to convince its inhabitants that, you know, the simulation was actually real and happening, straight away people go like, oh, like a computer game, you know, like San Andreas. But it's not. It's not. It, you know, the allegory of the cave, or Plato's cave, is basically this idea by the Greek philosopher Plato in this book, or I guess it's a collection of essays called The Republic. And it basically, the idea is this. So there's a group of people, sometimes it's described as prisoners, and they're chained to a wall in a cave, or they're stuck in a cave all of their lives. They were born there. And they're facing a blank wall, right? And they can see shadows on that wall, projected from a fire or some sort of light source. And they give names to these shadows. So they say, okay, that's a chicken, that's a person, that's a horse, whatever. And the shadows are basically the prisoner's reality. And if you had ever seen the real objects before, you would believe that the shadows of the object were real, right? So in the idea of Plato's cave, one prisoner is theoretically freed, and he finds out that the fire is creating the shadows. He's momentarily blinded when he first sees the fire. He's like, oh my gosh, it's a light source! And when he returns to the other prisoners to tell them what was casting the shadows, and it wasn't the sun after all, it was just this fire, he's also blinded by the comparative darkness. So there's this thing that Plato describes about being blinded by truth, but also being blinded when you return to try to describe to people who haven't yet seen the truth. And that you could describe that in a matrix way of like plugged into the matrix, taken out from the matrix. But one of the prisoners then escapes from the bindings and leaves the caves altogether, and he's shocked at the world he discovers outside the cave, as you would be if you were born inside a cave and your entire life you think that shadows are animals and all that you know is shadows, right? This is a hell of a experiment to do on people. I hope it wasn't actually done. I wouldn't put it past the Greeks. And he's shocked at the world he discovers outside the cave, obviously. And he becomes used to his new surroundings. He realizes that his former view of reality was totally wrong. He begins to understand the new world outside the cave, which is actually the real world, and sees that the sun is the source of life. And he goes on an intellectual journey and discovers the meaning of life, basically, which, I don't know, that seems to be the best thing to do. And the escaped prisoner represents the philosopher seeking truth, seeking knowledge outside the cave, and outside the obvious senses that we understand. The sun, or the fire, or the thing causing the shadows represents philosophical truth, and his intellectual journey represents all philosophers' journey, finding truth and wisdom. Then the other prisoners react to this escapee, represent people that are scared of knowing philosophical truths. They're like, whoa, no, don't tell me, I don't want to know, you're blowing my mind. Oh, this reminds me of a really cool book by Ray Bradbury. Another sort of book that relates to this is a book called Fahrenheit 451, and it's another one of my favorite sort of dystopic books, kind of like 1984, kind of like We. It's by Ray Bradbury, who's an awesome writer. But I have to admit, apart from this book, I haven't actually read that much by him. I know that he's got heaps of cool books, and they're not even super long. They're like 1960s paperback, sort of chuck in your back pocket sort of like size. So I really should read some more Ray Bradbury, because he has sensibly sized sci-fi books that are actually well written, and I'm a fan of not so massive books that are well written. So anyway, Fahrenheit 451 comes out in early 1950s, and the novel presents a future American society where there's no books, and these people called firemen burn the books, any books that they find. Another thing that's often related to simulation theory is the Matrix thing, with Morpheus offering Neo the red pill or the blue pill. The blue pill to sort of like just go back to your normal life, and the red pill to actually see real truth. So all of simulation hypothesis theory and all that kind of stuff all really goes back to Plato's cave. But a really important philosopher on that track towards the Matrix and towards what I want to do with my book is Descartes. Descartes, a French philosopher, and came up with the Cartesian doubt sort of hypothesis of his own, which is essentially that you can't really prove that you're not dreaming. Not totally. So the only thing you can prove is that you exist. So his great contribution to philosophy is, I think, therefore I am. Because I can't really be sure of anything else except for that. Cogito ergo sum. So the phrase originally appeared in his book Discourse on the Method, and then later on in Principles of Philosophy. And so Descartes says we cannot doubt of our existence while we doubt, if you know what I mean. And this proposition, along with Plato's cave, which is a little bit fuzzy, to be honest, but he's standing on the shoulders of giants here, you see. But the Cartesian doubt concept is really a cornerstone of Western philosophy. Another book that I've actually already written about in my book is Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard, who's a postmodern thinker, and basically the idea is after the death of God, and you know, all that signified stuff they blow your mind with in first year of university. They say like, you know, like we have words for things and then we have things, and they're not the same thing. Or are they? Maybe they are, because of how you think. And basically, under Baudrillard's ideas is that there's things in this world that are copies of things, and these copies become what the author describes as hyperreal, especially in what he calls hyperreality. It gets complex, but the reason I mention it now is that I found this interesting website called Accounting as Simulacrum and Hyperreality, Perspectives on Income and Capital. And it says this, okay, this paper draws on Baudrillard's concepts of simulacra, hyperreality, and implosion to trace the historical transformations of the accounting signs of income and capital from Sumerian times to the present. It posits that accounting today no longer refers to any objective reality, but instead circulates in a hyperreality of self-referential models. I don't even understand what that means. I have no idea. I guess what they're trying to say is that accounting and the world of business uses signs for things that exist, but they're self-referential because, you know, you're talking about income and then tax on that income and then expenditure, you know, like interest. It's all very, it's not shoulders of giants. What am I trying to say? It's sort of like referential to other references. I mean, you can apply them to real world. If you went to the bank and you said, I'd like to spend my money, but you couldn't say I'd like to remove all my money, and you certainly couldn't have all the citizens in the country say, can I please have my money now? For one thing, is that most people exist in negative in terms of how much they owe. And the other reason is that even if everyone did have money at the bank, they couldn't all remove it. They couldn't all withdraw it at the same time. But what does that money even mean? What is that, especially when it comes to accounting and how complex that can get in terms of interest rates and loans, and yeah, it gets weird. I don't know what the heck they were talking about though. Hyperreality and implosion to trace historical transformations of signs of income and capital. Whoa. So anyway, the merge. The merge. Who are the merge? So basically, I want them to be described in the book. They're like wearing VR goggles. They've got earphones on. They've got things up their nostrils. They've got mouth tubes for sensory information. They're covered in latex, like a gimp, to reduce any kind of sensation in reality. And what I'm going to do in my book is that throughout the worship pyramid, I'm going to use two different fonts. I'm just going to use, I don't know, italics and non-italics. I haven't actually done this yet in the things I printed off, except for one chapter where I just have this tiny little extract, and that goes from reality to what someone thinks is reality, but only for like a page, or maybe two pages, and then it returns to the other one. And I had this idea of like using fonts to describe, and it also allows me to sort of use some other writing, because I think what I'm best at is actually short stories. I think what I've done before for like competitions and just out of interest and things that I've read in public and stuff like that is short stories. I've never done a book before. I've never done a novel before. I have no idea what I'm doing at all. But the thing is that I like the short story genre. I like writing and introducing people within a small amount of time. And I love introductions. I love new characters, and I love closing off a chapter. It's fun. I like it. I like that style. And I was thinking that this offers me the opportunity to perhaps play around with some genres like war stories or historical stories, or just ones set in 1980s Yorkshire, the goth scene in England or something. Just something really, really out there that I can do, but within the worship pyramid overall story, because it won't be clear whether it's real or it's not. And when I mean real, I mean in the future with the worship pyramid characters, or actually it's a simulation. And I want to have a couple examples when it's not in that time, but it's still relevant, so it becomes a chapter, but then we never see those characters again. And that actually might be the Washington, D.C. part of my book, where we have a point of view from President Nixon, who I really want to use as a character, because I think he's a misunderstood president, really. I think he's been demonized by The Simpsons and by people that disliked his views and his influence on the Vietnam War. I think he's a misunderstood president. I think he's an arsehole, but I think that he's not quite as bad as he's been portrayed. There's a lot of interesting bills that were passed with him. environmental bills, protection of animals, some civil rights bills, and yeah, you can't say it's always just the president, but he certainly wasn't out there doing a whole lot of evil things and clubbing baby seals, as you would have believed from watching popular culture. Nixon is not as bad as he seems. But he's a misunderstood president. He's a awkward man. He is a complex man. And so anyway, I'm getting off topic. One of those chapters will be from the point of view of President Nixon, but it will not be actually a simulation. So I'm not going to put it in that font. I'm not going to put it in italics. What I'm going to use is italics for when it's a simulation in my book. So what are these simulations? These simulations are what these characters, who are called the Merge, are experiencing. They are what they think is reality. And essentially these Merge are forming alters of multiple individuals, somewhat similar to what happened in the 1960s march on the Pentagon, when there was an attempt to levitate the Pentagon, and the Merge used their latent psychic abilities to allow teleportation to occur. The Shepherds, which I'll talk about in another video, are a type of human that look after the Merge, kind of like horse handlers. But make no mistake, the Merge are very much slaves in this society. They allow teleportation, which is a crucial element to the civilization of the worship pyramid, but they have no idea that they are part of this evil system. Unlike the Guildborg, that are slightly aware that they're being taken advantage of, the Guildborg, who may be the 9th tier below, are not fully aware of what's occurring. So, lots of ideas. I'm starting to write a little bit more about them. I'm glad I've come up with this idea that allows me to write short stories and to posit it that it could be real, it might not be real, but by using this font idea, I've got this flow and pattern starting to appear. So I've written possibly 6 chapters maybe now, and once I edit them, I'll start doing some live podcast or just reading out, or maybe just make another YouTube video channel of me just reading the actual stuff. So I'm really glad to have got to this point where I can safely say I'm no longer procrastinating world building, although in this video, of course, I'm talking about world building, but I'm beyond the procrastination and I'm starting to write.